Poplicola Part 1. With Solon, whose story has now been completed, we compare Poplicola. Poplicola was an honorary surname bestowed upon him by the Roman people. Previously, he was called Publius Valerius, and was regarded as a descendant of that very Valerius, through whose efforts the Romans were once reconciled with the Sabines, and from enemies became one people, for it was chiefly he who persuaded the kings to put an end to their hostility and come to an agreement. From him, as it is reported, Publius Valerius traced his lineage, a man already distinguished for eloquence and wealth, even in the time when Rome was ruled by kings. The former he employed justly and skillfully solely in defense of truth. The latter he used generously and kindly to assist those in need, so that from the outset it was evident that, should monarchy give way to popular rule, Valerius would become one of the foremost men in the state. When the people, hating Tarquin the Proud, who had obtained power not by lawful means, but in defiance of divine and human law, and exercised it not as a king, but as an arrogant tyrant, rose in revolt, oppressed by his rule, the immediate cause of the uprising being the death of Lucretia, who, after suffering violence, took her own life. Lucius Brutus, who led the revolution, first of all turned to Valerius, and he took the most ardent part in the expulsion of the kings. As long as it seemed that the people intended to choose a single leader in place of the king, Valerius remained calm, believing that Brutus, as the first champion of liberty, had the stronger claim to authority. But the people detested even the very word monarchy, and, thinking that divided power would be less burdensome to endure, they wished to place two men at the helm of government. At this point, Valerius hoped that he would be chosen together with Brutus and would share with him the consular dignity. He was mistaken, however. Contrary to the wishes of Brutus, his colleague in office proved to be not Valerius, but Tarquinius Collatinus, the husband of Lucretia, a man in no way more deserving than Valerius. Yet influential Romans, still fearing the kings, who from abroad were making every effort to win the citizens over to their side, wished to have as leader their bitterest enemy, from whom the exiles could expect no concessions whatever. Part 2. Thus, the Romans did not believe that Valerius was capable of doing everything for the sake of the fatherland, since he personally had suffered no wrong from the tyrants. In his indignation, he ceased to take part in meetings of the Senate, no longer defended the accused in court, and in general abandoned public affairs altogether. As a result, anxious rumors arose, and many Romans expressed fear lest, yielding to anger, he might go over to the side of the kings and bring about the ruin of the city, whose position was precarious. Since Brutus also harbored suspicions against certain others, he demanded that the Senate take a solemn oath. On the appointed day, Valerius appeared in the forum with a joyful and serene expression, and was the first to swear that he would yield nothing and submit in nothing to the Tarquins, but would fight for liberty without sparing his strength. This oath, which delighted the Senate and encouraged the consuls, he soon confirmed by action. Envoys arrived from Tarquin bearing documents alluring to the people, filled with flattering language, by means of which the envoys confidently expected to overcome the hatred of the crowd toward the king, who, they claimed, had abandoned his former arrogance and now put forward only very moderate demands. The consuls at first decided to allow them to address the people, but Valerius opposed and prevented this, fearing lest among the poor, for whom war is more grievous than tyranny, a cause and pretext for upheaval might arise. Part 3. After this, other envoys arrived. They announced that Tarquin renounced the kingship and ceased all hostile actions, but requested that his property and money be restored to him, his friends, and his relatives, so that they might have means of subsistence in exile. Many were moved by this, especially since Collatinus supported the king's request. Then Brutus, a man of inflexible and fiery temperament, rushed into the forum shouting that his colleague was a traitor, since with a lavish hand he was supplying resources for war and the revival of tyranny to men to whom it would have been dangerous even to give money for their journey. When the citizens assembled, Gaius Minucius, who held no office in the government, was the first to speak, urging Brutus and all the Romans to see to it that the money would rather aid them in the struggle against the tyrants than aid the tyrants in the struggle against them. Nevertheless, the Romans resolved that, Since the king did not intend to deprive them of the liberty for which they had fought, they should not forfeit peace over money, but should send the money into exile together with the tyrants. In truth, Tarquin cared least of all about the money. His request was in the nature of a test of the people, and at the same time a preparation for treachery. Indeed, this was precisely what the envoys were engaged in, while assuring everyone that they were absorbed in matters of property, selling some things, holding others for the time being, sending still others to their owners. They remained in Rome until they had drawn into treason two of the most distinguished and noble houses, the Aquilii and the Vitellii. Both families were closely connected with the consuls by kinship, and through these ties they succeeded in corrupting even the sons of Brutus himself, persuading them that, once freed from their father's severity and feigned simplicity, they might ally themselves with the house of the Tarquins and perhaps attain royal power. The conspirators bound themselves by a dreadful oath, sealed with human blood and the touch of entrails. In the dark and almost empty house of the Aquilii, they plotted the murder of the consuls and entrusted letters describing their plans to the envoys of Tarquin. A slave named Vindicius, who had hidden himself there by chance, overheard everything. Torn between fear and conscience, he dared not accuse such powerful men openly, yet could not remain silent. Trusting in the humanity and accessibility of Valerius, whose house was always open to the needy and who never despised a man of low station, he went straight to him and revealed the whole conspiracy. Part 5. When Vindicius came to him and recounted everything in the presence of only Valerius's wife and his brother Marcus, Valerius, shocked and alarmed, did not release the slave, but locked him in a room, stationing his wife at the door, and instructed his brother to surround the royal household, search for the letters if possible, and take the slaves into custody. Valerius himself, with clients and friends, of whom he always had many around him, and a large retinue, proceeded to the house of the Aquilii. He did not find the owners. Since apparently no one expected his arrival, he entered and discovered the letters in the room where the envoys had stayed. At that moment, the Aquilii hurried there on foot and, meeting Valerius at the door, tried to snatch the letters from him. Valerius' companions defended themselves and, throwing the togas over the opponents' necks with great difficulty, taking blows and giving them in return, finally forced their way through narrow alleys to the forum. Simultaneously, the same occurred at the royal household. Marcus seized other letters hidden among packed and ready-to-send items and dragged the king's retainers he could catch to the forum. Part 6. When the consuls restored order, Valerius ordered Vindicius to be brought forward, and charges were laid. Then the letters were read. Those caught dared not utter a word in their defense, remaining embarrassed and sullenly silent, while the others said little. Only a few, seeking Brutus's favor, mentioned the exile. Some faint glimmers of hope were also seen in the tears of Collatinus and in the silence of Valerius. But Brutus, calling each of the sons separately, said, "Well, Titus, well, Tiberius, why do you not answer the accusation?" And when, despite the question being repeated 3 times, neither uttered a word, the father turned to the lictors and said, "The matter now lies with you." They immediately seized the young men, stripped them of their clothing, bound their hands behind their backs, and began to scourge them with rods. Meanwhile, as the others could not bear to watch, the consul himself, it is said, did not avert his gaze. Pity did not soften the stern and fierce expression on his face. He followed with a heavy gaze as his children were punished until the lictors, having laid them on the ground, struck off their heads with axes. Turning over the remaining conspirators to the judgment of his colleague, Brutus rose and departed. His action, however one wishes to judge it, cannot be either praised or condemned easily. Either supreme virtue rendered his soul utterly impassive, or, conversely, great suffering had deadened it completely. Both possibilities are extraordinary, surpassing the bounds of human nature, yet the first is divine, the second that of a wild beast. It is fairer, however, that judgment of this man follow the path of his glory, and that our own weakness not cause doubt of his virtue. In any case, the Romans held that the founding of the city by Romulus had not required as much effort as it took Brutus to establish and secure the democratic form of government. Part 7. Thus, when Brutus left the forum, all remained silent for a long time. None could recover from astonishment and horror at what had taken place before their eyes. But knowing the gentle nature of Collatinus and seeing his hesitation, the Aquilii became somewhat emboldened again and requested a postponement to prepare a defense speech and to have Vindicius delivered to them, as he was their slave and should not remain in the hands of the accusers. The consul wished to grant their request and had begun to dismiss the assembly, but Valerius, his followers closely surrounding the slave, refused to surrender him and would not allow the people to disperse, thus keeping the conspirators in custody. In the end, he forcibly detained the accused and began calling for Brutus, shouting that Collatinus acted monstrously for having forced his colleague to become the executioner of his own children. He now thought it permissible to appease women, to spare the lives of traitors and enemies of the fatherland. The consul was outraged and ordered Vindicius removed. The lictors, parting the crowd, seized the slave and beat those who tried to take him. Valerius's friends interposed, while the people loudly called for Brutus. Brutus returned, and when everyone fell silent, prepared to hear him, he said that he had judged his own sons sufficiently, but that the fate of the others was to be decided by the free citizens. Let anyone speak and persuade the people. Yet no speeches were needed. The vote was immediate. The accused were unanimously condemned and executed by decapitation. Collatinus, due to his kinship with the kings, was apparently not fully trusted, and the second name of the consul was detested by the Romans, who had sworn a sacred oath not to yield to Tarquin. What happened inspired direct hatred of him among the people, and he voluntarily resigned authority and left the city. New elections were held, and the citizens, with acclaim, chose Valerius as consul, earning a worthy reward for his devotion to the fatherland. Believing Vindicius also deserved recognition, Valerius decreed that he be the first among freedmen to gain Roman citizenship and vote, joining any of the curia. In general, freedmen received the right to vote only much later from Appius, who wished to gratify the people. Full and unconditional release to freedom is still called a vindicta, as they say. After that, Vindicius. Part 8. Then the consuls turned the king's property over to the Romans for plunder, and the royal and city houses were leveled. Tarquinius had owned the best part of the Campus Martius. This was now dedicated to the god. The harvest had been recently gathered, and the sheaves still lay in the field. Thinking that, once consecrated, this grain could neither be ground nor eaten, the citizens assembled and threw everything into the river. Likewise, the trees felled across the estate were thrown into the water, leaving the land entirely bare, transferred to the god. The sheaves and trunks, in great numbers and without order, were heaped into enormous piles, and the river carried them only a short distance, as the first caught on a shoal and blocked the way for the following. These got stuck, tangled, and the connection between the parts grew stronger and inseparable, reinforced by the current, which deposited silt, forming fertile, sticky soil, while the water pressure did not wash it away but gradually compacted and consolidated it. The size and stability of this accumulation favored further growth. Almost everything floating down the river was detained. This became the present sacred island in Rome, on which stand temples of the gods and porticos for walks, called in Latin inter duos pons, between two bridges. Some writers report that this did not occur at the time Tarquin's land was consecrated, but later, when another, neighboring plot was dedicated. This Tarquinia was a virgin priestess, one of the Vestals, honored greatly for her gift. Among women, she alone had the right to testify in court, though she never married. Such are the traditions of how this occurred. Part 9. Tarquinius, having abandoned all thought of regaining power through treachery, was gladly received by the Etruscans and outfitted with a large army for campaign. The consuls led Romans to meet him and arranged them in sacred places, one called the Arceus Grove, the other the Anzus Meadow. When the enemies were still beginning the battle, Tarquinius' son Aruns and the Roman consul Brutus collided, not by chance, but having unleashed their horses upon each other, burning with rage and mutual hatred, one against the tyrant and enemy of the fatherland, the other against the cause of his exile. They were guided more by blind fury than reason, spared neither themselves, and both fell together. The end of the battle was no less fierce and terrible than its beginning. Both armies inflicted losses upon the enemy and suffered equal harm, yet a storm separated them. This uncertain outcome troubled Valerius, who saw his soldiers faltering, seeing the corpses of their own, yet proud of the havoc they wrought among the enemy. So great were the slain that the true losses of both sides could not be established. Meanwhile, with the situation at home before their eyes, knowledge of the enemy's losses was only by conjecture, and thus both Romans and Etruscans thought themselves more defeated than victorious. Night came, and as usually happens after a fierce battle, the camps fell silent, when suddenly the grove shook, and from it issued a loud voice, declaring that one more Etruscan had died than Roman. Clearly a divine pronouncement, for upon hearing it, the Romans were immediately filled with courage and shouted joyfully, while the Etruscans, utterly disheartened, fled in confusion and mostly dispersed. The remaining nearly 5,000 were captured by the Romans, and their property plundered. The enemy's dead numbered 11,300, the Romans one fewer. The battle, it is reported, occurred the day before the Kalends of March. Valerius received a triumph for the victory and was the first consul to enter Rome in a 4-horse chariot. It was a grand and glorious spectacle, not burdensome or painful to the spectators, as some claim. Were that true, triumphs would not have remained for long years objects of such zealous ambition and scrutiny. All approved the honors Valerius paid to his colleague's body, and especially the speech at the funeral. It was so admired and loved by the Romans that from then on it became customary to deliver a laudatory speech for every worthy and outstanding man after death, performed by the best citizens. It is even said that Valerius's speech predates Greek funerary orations, though the orator Anaximenes writes that this innovation belongs to Solon. Part 10. But what truly stirred dissatisfaction and hatred toward Valerius was this. Brutus, considered the father of freedom by the people, did not wish to rule alone, yet both chose a colleague. And this man, said the citizens, by combining all in himself, inherits not Brutus's consulship, which has no claim upon him, but Tarquin's tyranny. What use to praise Brutus in words, when in deeds he imitates Tarquin, and, surrounded by all the lictor bundles and axes, descends alone to the forum from a house so vast that even the royal house he destroyed was smaller? And indeed, Valerius lived too splendidly, in a house on the so-called Velia, overlooking the forum from above. Climbing to it was no small effort, and when the owner descended, his appearance was grand, and his proud retinue seemed truly royal. Here Valerius demonstrated the advantage for one in power, handling matters of great importance, of keeping ears open to candid and truthful words and closed to flattery. Hearing from friends that, in the opinion of the people, his conduct was improper, he did not protest or become angry, but quickly gathered a crowd of craftsmen, and that very night demolished the entire house to its foundations, so that by morning the Romans, gathering and seeing it, admired the strength of spirit of this man, lamented and mourned the house, its grandeur and beauty, like a man unjustly destroyed by envy, lamenting that their consul, like a homeless man, had taken refuge in another's home. Indeed, friends sheltered Valerius, and he lived with them until the people assigned him a plot and built a house, smaller and more modest than the previous. On that site now stands the temple called the Sanctuary of Victoria Pota. Wishing to make even his authority gentle, less formidable, and even pleasing to the people, Valerius ordered the axes removed from the lictor bundles, and the bundles lowered and inclined before the people whenever the consul entered the assembly. This custom, greatly enhancing the appearance of the democracy, is observed by magistrates to this day. The crowd did not understand that the consul had not humbled himself, as most thought, but by his modesty suppressed envy and expanded and strengthened his power as much as it seemed he had restricted his rights. For now the people willingly and gladly obeyed him, even calling him Poplicola. This surname, meaning friend of the people, and more widely used than his previous names, we shall continue to use in telling the life of this man. Part 11. He allowed those who wished to seek the consulship the opportunity to do so, but before the election of a colleague, not knowing what would follow, and fearing that out of envy or ignorance the colleague might oppose his plans, He used sole authority to carry out extremely important and beneficial state reforms. First, he replenished the Senate, which had been greatly reduced. Some had died earlier during Tarquin's reign, others in the recent battle. It is said that he added a total of 164 men to the rolls. Then he enacted laws, one of which granted the people particularly great power, allowing the accused to appeal a consul's decision to the assembly. Another law condemned to death anyone who assumed authority without the will of the people. A third law eased the position of the poor by exempting citizens from taxes. By this same law, Poplicola encouraged all to engage in trades more eagerly than before. A law punishing disobedience to the consuls also seemed aimed more at the benefit of ordinary citizens than of the powerful. A defiant citizen was fined 5 cows and 2 sheep. The price of a sheep was 10 obols, a cow 100. At that time, money was not yet in wide use among the Romans, and wealth was measured by the number of livestock. Hence, property is still called peculium, from the name for small livestock, and on their earliest coins they minted images of a cow, sheep, or pig. Children were given names such as Suilius, Bubulcus, Caprarius, Porcius, for capra is Latin for goat, and porcus means pig. Part 12. Thus presenting himself as a moderate and people-friendly legislator, Poplicola enacted a law of extreme severity. He passed a statute allowing anyone to kill a man planning to become a tyrant without trial, the killer being free of guilt provided he presented evidence exposing the intended tyrant. For if it were impossible for one plotting such a deed to remain entirely unexposed, it was quite possible that, once revealed, he might warn the court and escape unharmed. Hence, Poplicola granted anyone capable the right to execute the punishment which the crime sought to avoid. Poplicola also won praise for the law concerning quaestors. As citizens were required to contribute from their property for military expenses, and the consul himself did not wish to handle financial matters, refused to entrust them to friends, and would not allow public funds to enter private hands, he established the treasury in the Temple of Saturn, where the Romans still keep the state funds, and proposed that the people elect 2 young men as treasurer quaestors. The first quaestors chosen were Publius Valerius and Marcus Minucius. A great deal of money was contributed, for the lists numbered 130,000 citizens, not counting orphans and widows who did not contribute. Having settled these concerns, Poplicola took Lucretius, father of Lucretia, as his colleague, and, in deference to his seniority, handed over to him the so-called fasces. This honor, granted to the elder by custom, became established and has persisted to our times. But after a few days, Lucretius died. New elections were held, and Marcus Horatius became consul, ruling with Poplicola for the remainder of the year. Part 13. When Tarquinius in Etruria prepared a second war against the Romans, an important omen appeared. While still ruling in Rome, Tarquinius had completed construction of the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, and, whether obeying prophecy or for some other reason, decided to crown the building with a clay model of a 4-horse chariot. He commissioned Etruscan artisans from Veii, and shortly afterward lost the kingdom. The Etruscans shaped the chariot and placed it in the kiln, but what occurred was unlike the usual behavior of clay in fire. It did not shrink or settle as the moisture evaporated. Rather, it swelled, gaining both size and such hardness and strength that it could scarcely be removed without dismantling the vault and breaking the kiln walls. The soothsayers concluded it was a divine sign, promising prosperity and power to the owners of the chariot, and the citizens of Veii decided not to give it away, replying to the Romans demanding their property that the chariot belonged to Tarquinius, but not to those who had expelled him. A few days later, equestrian games were held at Veii with their customary splendor and ceremony. The charioteer, crowned with a wreath, slowly drove the victorious team off the hippodrome, when suddenly, without any apparent cause, but either by divine will or by chance, the horses were frightened and rushed at full speed toward Rome. Despite all efforts to rein them in or calm them with gentle coaxing, the charioteer had to give way, letting go of the reins. And the horses carried him until they reached the Capitoline and threw him to the ground near the gate now called the Ratumen Gate. After this, the citizens of Veii, astonished and alarmed, ordered the artisans to surrender the chariot. Part 14. The vow to build the temple of Jupiter. Capitolinus had been made by Tarquinius, son of Demaratus, during the war with the Sabines, and it was completed by Tarquinius the Proud, son or grandson of the one who made the vow. But he did not live to dedicate it. The building was nearly finished when Tarquinius lost power. After the final completion, when the temple was duly adorned, Poplicola, ambitious, desired to dedicate it himself. However, most powerful citizens envied him, and while tolerating the honors due to him as legislator and general, thought he had no right to this last honor, and therefore persuaded and incited Horatius to oppose his colleague and assume the dedication himself. Poplicola had to embark on a campaign, and his adversaries, having decreed that Horatius dedicate the temple, escorted the consul to the Capitoline, fully aware that they would never succeed in Poplicola's presence. Some claim that the consuls were assigned by lot, one against his will, to go on campaign, the other to dedicate the temple. How this occurred is evident from the events surrounding the dedication. On the Ides of September, approximately the full moon in the month Metagintian, everyone assembled on the Capitoline. When silence fell, the Horati performed the rites and, as custom required, touched the daughters with his hand, preparing to speak the prescribed words of dedication, when suddenly Poplicola's brother Marcus, long waiting at the door for this moment, said, "Consul, your son has fallen ill in camp and died." The news grieved all who heard it, yet Horatius remained unmoved, saying only, "Throw the body wherever you wish. Sorrow has no access to me," and completed the ritual. The report was false. Marcus invented it to obstruct Horatius, and the remarkable composure of this man, either immediately discerning the deception or believing it, remaining steadfast, is astonishing. Part 15. It seems that similar circumstances marked the dedication of the Second Temple. The first, as already mentioned, was built by Tarquinius and dedicated by Horatius, but it burned down during the civil wars. The second was rebuilt by Sulla, who did not live to see its completion. Therefore, the dedicatory inscription bears the name of Catullus. This temple in turn perished during the revolt under Vitellius, and for the third time it was entirely reconstructed by Vespasian. Fortune accompanied him, as always. He saw the temple completed, but did not see it destroyed again, surpassing Sulla in luck, for Sulla died before dedicating his work, while Vespasian died shortly before his overthrow. In the year of Vespasian's death, the Capitoline was devastated by fire. Finally, the fourth, which exists today, was completed and dedicated by Domitian. It is reported that Tarquinius spent 40,000 pounds of silver on laying the foundations. But as for the current temple, the wealthiest private fortunes in Rome would not have sufficed to cover even the gilding, which alone cost more than 12,000 talents. The columns were carved from Pentelic marble with the most exquisite proportions of thickness to height. I saw them myself in Athens. But in Rome, they were further hewn and polished, which did not so much enhance their brilliance as rob them of proportion and beauty. They appeared thin and feeble. Yet if anyone, astonished by the luxury of the Capitoline, had seen in Domitian's palace merely one portico or a basilica or baths or the chambers of concubines, then, following Epicharmus, who said to a prodigal, "You love men not at all, you are mad, not generous," he could hardly have refrained from addressing Domitian in words to this effect: "You are neither pious nor generous, you are simply ill. You delight in squandering wealth on endless buildings, and like the infamous Midas, you wish all to be of stone and gold." But enough of this. Part 16. After the great battle, having lost his son, who fell in single combat with Brutus, Tarquinius fled to Clusium and sought aid from Lars Porsena, the most powerful of the Italian kings, famed for both generosity and courage. Porsena promised support and began by sending envoys to Rome, demanding that Tarquinius be reinstated. The Romans did not comply, and Porsena then declared war, specifying the time and place of his invasion, and appeared with a large army as appointed. Poplicola, absent at the time, was elected consul a second time, along with Titus Lucretius. Returning to Rome and wishing above all to surpass Porsena in firmness of spirit, Poplicola founded the city of Signuria, though the enemy was already close, expended great effort to fortify it with walls, and sent 700 settlers there, to show how insignificant he regarded this war and how little he feared it. But after a fierce assault, the king dislodged the guards from the Janiculum, and in their headlong flight, they almost led the enemy into Rome. Only at the city gates did Poplicola arrive to assist, and engaging the enemy at the river, he held back their superior forces until, covered in numerous wounds, he fell and was carried from the battlefield. When his colleague, Lucretius, suffered the same fate, the Romans lost heart and fled to the city to save their lives. The enemy surged toward the wooden bridge, and Rome was nearly captured by assault. But Horatius Cocles and two other celebrated men, Hermanius and Larsius, were the first to resist at the bridge. Horatius earned the surname Cocles, having lost one eye in the war. Others assert that he had been so snub-nosed that there was scarcely space between his eyes, with his brows joined, and the people, wishing to call him a cyclops, but mispronouncing the word, transformed it into Cocles. Thus, standing at the bridge, he held the enemy at bay until his comrades broke the bridge behind him. Then, fully armed, he leapt into the river, swam across, and reached the high opposite bank, though an Etruscan spear struck him in the buttock. Admiring his courage, Poplicola proposed that all Romans immediately bring and give him as much food as each consumed daily, and later grant him as much land as Cocles could plow in a day. Finally, a bronze statue was erected to him in the Temple of Vulcan, honoring him for the lameness resulting from his wound. Part 17. Porsena pressed Rome ever harder, and famine began in the city, while meanwhile another Etruscan army entered Roman territory on its own initiative. Poplicola, elected consul for the third time, judged that Porsena should be opposed while remaining in the city and carefully guarding it. But he engaged the Etruscans, defeated them, and put them to flight. The enemy lost 5,000 men. The exploit of Mucius is recounted by many in varying ways. We shall relate it here in the form considered closest to the truth. He was a man of every virtue, especially martial. Having planned to kill Porsena, he dressed in Etruscan fashion and, knowing the enemy language, infiltrated the camp. He circled the elevation where the king sat with his retinue, but, not knowing him by sight and fearing discovery, he drew his sword and killed the one among those seated who seemed to him most to resemble the king. Mucius was immediately seized and questioned. Nearby, he saw a brazier with burning coals, prepared for Porsena, who was about to make a sacrifice. Mucius placed his right hand upon it, and standing before the king, looked him resolutely and unflinchingly in the face, while the fire consumed his hand. This continued until Porsena, struck, released him, and handed him the sword from the elevation. Mucius took it with his left hand, whence, they say, his surname Scaevola, meaning left-handed. He said that he had conquered fear of Porsena, but was overcome by his magnanimity, and therefore, in gratitude, would reveal what he would never have disclosed, yielding to force. 300 Romans, he continued, with the same intent as I, roam your camp, waiting for a convenient opportunity. I drew lots to begin, and I am not resentful of fate because I erred and did not kill a noble man, who ought to be a friend rather than an enemy to the Romans. Porsena believed his words and began to incline toward a truce, not so much, I think, from fear of 300 assassins, but in admiration and awe of the courage and valor of the Romans. This man is called Mucius and Scaevola, but Athenodorus, son of Sandon, in a work dedicated to Caesar's sister Octavia, says he had another name, Lateborn. Part 18. For his part, Poplicola regarded Porsena not so much as a formidable enemy, but as a man worthy to become a friend and ally of Rome, and therefore he willingly entrusted to him the adjudication of the dispute with Tarquinius. He repeatedly and with full confidence in his own justice summoned the king to this, promising to prove that the Romans rightly had deprived the worst of men of power. But such a course provoked sharp objections from Tarquinius, who declared that he would submit to no judge, especially not to Porsena, since he who had once promised aid now drew back, and Porsena, indignant and resentful, hearing also the entreaties of his son Aruns, who zealously pleaded for the Romans, ceased the war on the condition that the enemy clear the lands he had seized in Etruria and return the captives, receiving in exchange his own defectors. To confirm these terms, the Romans delivered hostages, 10 of the most noble patricians and an equal number of young women, among whom was the daughter of Poplicola, Valeria. Part 19. In fulfilling his obligations, Porsena had already completely ceased hostilities when one day Roman girls went down to the river to bathe, at the spot where the bank curves in a crescent, rendering the current calm and gentle. Seeing no guards nearby, nor any other eyes on land or water, they were suddenly seized by an irresistible desire to cross the Tiber, a river so swift and full of deep pools. Some write that one of the girls, named Cloelia, swam across on horseback, encouraging the others. When they safely reached Poplicola, he was not elated by their deed, nor even approved it, but was distressed that they might be considered less conscientious than Porsena, and that the audacity of the girls might be attributed to Roman cunning. Having gathered the fugitives, he sent them all back to Porsena. Tarquinius' men, having learned of this in advance, lay in ambush at the crossing and, with superior numbers, attacked those escorting the girls. The escorts, however, defended themselves, and Valeria, Poplicola's daughter, breaking through the thick of the fighting, fled, accompanied by 3 slaves who saved her. The other girls, with no small risk to themselves, remained among the fighters. But Aruns, Porsena's son, learning of the events, immediately rushed to aid the Romans and delivered them from mortal danger, turning the enemy to flight. When the girls were brought to Porsena, he looked upon them and asked who had initiated the escape and led the others. They named Cloelia. Porsena regarded her with a benevolent and cheerful gaze, ordered a richly adorned horse brought from the royal stables, and presented it to the girl. Those who hold that Cloelia alone crossed the river on horseback consider this confirmation of their view. Others disagree, believing that the Etruscans simply wished to honor her truly manly courage. At the place where the sacred street begins to ascend, the Palatine, stands an equestrian statue of Cloelia, though some consider it to represent Valeria. Not to mention many other proofs of the king's magnanimity, which, reconciling with the Romans, Porsena gave to the city. He did not permit the Etruscans to take anything with them except weapons, and leaving a camp full of grain and all manner of goods, delivered it to the Romans. For this reason, even now, when public property is sold at auction, the sale is first announced as that of Porsena's goods, ever preserving the memory of this man for his kindness and beneficence. Moreover, near the Senate building stood a bronze statue of Porsena of coarse and ancient workmanship. Part 20. Soon the Sabines invaded Roman territory. The consuls were elected as Marcus Valerius, Poplicola's brother, and Postumius Tubertus. Following Poplicola's counsel and direct guidance in all matters of importance, Marcus won victory in 2 great battles, and for the second, in which he killed 13,000 enemies without losing a single Roman, he received, in addition to a triumph, an honorary gift, a house built on the Palatine Hill at public expense. At that time, doors in all houses opened inward, but in Marcus Valerius' house the door was made to open outward, an exception, indicating that he could always take part in any state affair. It is said that, conversely, all Greek houses previously opened outward. This conclusion is drawn from a comedy in which, before going out into the street, one strikes and knocks from within on one's own door to notify passers-by or those lingering near the house, without injuring them with door leaves swinging into a narrow alley. Part 21. The following year, Poplicola was consul again, for the 4th time. War was expected with the Sabines and the Latins, who had allied. At the same time, the city was gripped by superstitious fear. All pregnant women miscarried, none were able to carry to term. Following the guidance of the Sibylline books, Poplicola appeased Pluto, then, on the advice of the Pythian oracle of Apollo, arranged games, and, instilling calm in the citizens through hope in the gods, turned his mind to the dangers threatening Rome. The assembly and preparation of enemies seemed unprecedented. Among the Sabines was a certain Appius Claudius, a wealthy, strong, and brave man, but surpassing others above all in moral qualities and eloquence. He did not escape the common fate of all eminent men, envy, and gave the envious themselves reason for accusations, dissuading fellow citizens from war. The enemy claimed he sought Rome's elevation to deprive the fatherland of freedom and subject it to a tyrant. Seeing that such words met with favorable reception among the populace, while he himself enjoyed no support from the majority, disposed to hostility, Claudius feared to appeal to the court. Yet possessing significant forces of like-minded friends and relatives ready to defend him, he raised a revolt. This prevented the Sabines from beginning the war at the appointed time. Poplicola, deeming it vital not only to carefully observe these events, but also to inflame the revolt, had faithful men who, on his behalf, conveyed to Claudius roughly the following. Poplicola thinks that you, a noble and just man, should not defend yourself against your own citizens with evil, even though you have suffered injury from them. But if you wished, in saving yourself, to relocate, to flee from those who hate you, he would, on behalf of the state and privately, receive you as your virtue deserves and as the glory of the Roman people demands. Having considered all carefully, Claudius found this solution the best among those remaining, and calling his friends, who also persuaded many to adopt the same decision, led from their homes 5,000 families, men, women, and children, the most peaceful, calm, and gentle among the Sabines, and brought them into Rome. Poplicola, forewarned, received them so warmly and graciously that nothing more could be desired. The consul immediately incorporated the Sabine families into the state and allotted each 2 jugera of land by the Anio River, granting Claudius 25 jugera and enrolling him in the Senate. Starting from such a high position, Claudius conducted himself with such prudence that he attained the highest honor and great power and laid the foundation of the Claudian family, one of the most illustrious in Rome. Part 22. Thanks to this resettlement, the quarrels among the Sabines came to an end, yet self-serving seekers of popular favor would not allow peace to take hold. They asked with indignation, what if Claudius, transformed into an exile and enemy, achieves by cunning what he failed to accomplish through direct persuasion? Will he not prevent the Sabines from settling accounts with the Romans for all their grievances? At last, a large army marched out and encamped near Fidenae, hiding 2,000 heavily armed infantry in a wooded hollow just before Rome. The Sabines planned to send forth a small detachment of cavalry at early dawn to seize plunder. The horsemen were to approach the city, then turn to flight and retreat until they had lured the enemy into an ambush. But Poplicola, learning of this from defectors on the same day, quickly prepared and divided his forces. His son-in-law Postumius Albus, with 3,000 heavy infantry, took the hilltops under which the Sabines lay in ambush and kept constant watch over the enemy. The second consul, Lucretius, was entrusted with the youngest and most agile soldiers to attack the horsemen who would ride out for the plunder. And Poplicola himself, taking the remaining forces, struck the enemy in the rear. By a fortunate accident for the Romans, a thick fog fell at dawn, and simultaneously Postumius struck from above upon those hidden in ambush. Lucretius threw his men against the vanguard of the cavalry, and Poplicola attacked the enemy camp. Everywhere the Sabines fared poorly, suffering heavy losses. Ceasing resistance and turning to flight, they were immediately cut down by the Romans. The mere hope of escape turned to bitter misfortune. Each believed that comrades elsewhere had prevailed and made no effort to hold their position, yet some fled from the camp toward those in ambush, others toward the fortifications, so that the fugitives encountered on the way those whom they sought for aid, only to find that these too required assistance. On that day, the Sabines would have perished entirely, none surviving, had not the proximity of the city of Fidenae proven saving, chiefly for those who had escaped from the camp as the Romans stormed it. All the rest were either slain or taken prisoner. Part 23. The Romans, who customarily ascribe every great success to the divine, considered this victory the merit of the general alone, and the participants in battle openly stated that Poplicola had delivered the enemies into their hands, feeble, blind, and nearly bound hand and foot. Moreover, the people grew strong and wealthy from the spoils and captives. Poplicola celebrated a triumph, transferred power to the newly elected consuls, and soon thereafter died, having accomplished in his life all that is highest and most excellent that human beings may attain. The Romans, convinced that they had never properly honored Poplicola in life, while their debt of gratitude to the deceased remained unpaid, decided to bury his body at public expense, each contributing a quarter of an as. The women, having conspired among themselves, wore mourning for him for a full year, honorable and enviable. He was buried, also by the citizens by decree, within the city walls, near the so-called Velia, and his entire family has the right to be interred in that place. Now, however, no one is buried there. Rather, a corpse is brought, the bier is lowered, and someone briefly presents a burning torch to it, thereby confirming that the rite may be performed there, though they voluntarily decline the honor, after which the funeral procession moves onward.